Greetings, all you lovers of lore and legend, whether student, teacher, parent, teller of tales, or fairy ogre appendage reattachment specialists.
The Great Tales is a podcast about myths and legends from both inside and outside the Christian tradition, and we come to you live twice a month to talk about these great stories that Christians have been reading and passing on for centuries, and sometimes even longer than that.
Last time, we finished up our discussion of the Holy Grail, or at least our first discussion about the Holy Grail, in the tale of Percival by Chrétien de Troyes, the original Grail story showing how it owes a lot to the shape of the Orthodox Christian divine liturgy.
And this time, we are going to discuss probably the greatest 10% of Old English poetry, that poem about the man, the myth, the legend, the nemesis of the double gigantic and monodraconic, that great son of Sweden, the greatest and geatiest of the Geats, Beowulf.
He may also be the yeetiest of the yeats.
That's true.
Since that's probably how you say that word. But in any case, it's funny because one time I asked Dr. Michael Drought, who's my Anglo-Saxon teacher.
Nice.
And I ran into him at a conference and I said, Dr. Drought, I have a question for you. I said, I've been following your stuff. He used to have this thing he did called Beowulf Aloud, where he was basically just reading the entire Beowulf poem aloud in Old English, and it was like a podcast, and that's all it was. It was just Beowulf in Old English out loud. And I listened to it for a long time and listened to it again and again, and really enjoyed it. I said, but you always say Geat, but isn't it yeet, yet, like yet, And he thought about it for a moment. And he goes, "Gosh darn it!" So. Anyway,
made him start over.
Anyway, yeah, just got to start all over again. But in any case, it does. It's funny because gach and yech in Old English, or at least in this particular case, they still count for purposes of alliteration. So we'll give an example. Huatwe gardena in yerdagum, right? That the Gardena and the Spear Danes and Yerdagum, the days of old, the days of yore, those words do actually alliterate as far as the Old English are concerned. But in any case,
it's. I mean, I thought you were going to say some kind of reference to yeeting, like as you kids say these days, like he yeeted him out the window.
Yes,
or he yeeted the ball over.
Obviously,
to me.
This is a way that I frequently talk all the time, very normally.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I mean, we just had the Super Bowl, so I assume there was a lot of yeeting going on there as well. Isn't that what happens with the pointy ball?
Man,
game?
You're asking the wrong person. Just asking the wrong person.
The ball over to number 265, or
that's right, something like that. Yeah. So let's talk about things we actually know about.
Okay.
Which will be. Beowulf. Which would be Beowulf. So I think since you had something you wanted to do to start
a little something I wanted to share here at the beginning, and it goes like this: What we gardena in Yerdagom, Theod Kinuga, Thrim Yefrunen, Hutha Athelingas, Ellen Fremedon, oft shield shiving, Sherdena Threatum, Monigum Magthum, Meodo Settler Oftech, Exoda Erlas, Sitan Arest Werth Verschaft Funden, Heith as frovre je bad, werks under woknum, werth mindum thach, othat him ag wilch thara im setendra, over hron hada hiren shoulder, gumban gildan. That was good keening.
I love this intro because this character will never come up in the story again.
I know, it's so funny. The whole poem starts out about.
No, it's I mean, Beowulf is a peculiar poem,
and
right?
This is the beginning. This is the very beginning of the poem. Yes. Everybody, by the way, if you
the actual main character doesn't show up for several hundred lines yet. But this is sometimes it's called the exordium. But it basically sets the mythic backdrop by basically setting the story in what would have been the equivalent in the Germanic Iron Age of like Arthur's Camelot. Heorot, not so much a silly place. As it turns out.
They're not doing any Clark Gable impersonations in Heorot.
So, the Beowulf poem is what we're going to talk about today. I very often refer to it as the Beowulf poem, which is like, I think, an old Oxfordism. But it's because the poem does not actually itself have a name. Yeah. There's no title on the manuscript. So a lot of people just sort of call it Beowulf for short, but it is technically the Beowulf poem, as in, oh, that poem about Beowulf, the only one, right? So it's the Beowulf poem.
Right.
But the Beowulf poem it's a study in contradictions, right? So it's written in Old English, but no English characters appear anywhere in the poem.
Much like, most of Shakespearean a significant chunk of Shakespearean drama is about Italians.
Yes. Yeah, well, it's sort of, yes. And that's because Shakespeare has like a book of Italian stories he's sort of rewriting. Yeah. Those are set. But of course, all of the low people, all of the funny commoners are very obviously English.
Oh, sure. Absolutely.
But so it's written in Old English, but there's no English characters in the poem. It's set in Denmark, but the main hero is a Geat or a Geat.
Swede.
Sometimes people say it. He's not a Swede. Very importantly, he's not a Swede. He's from a tribe of people.
Everyone in the chat, tell him that he's a Swede.
A tribe of people that lived in what is now modern day Sweden, but very importantly, actually, for the background of the poem, are in a blood feud with the Swedes.
Yeah.
So in that sense, Beowulf is the opposite of a Swede. Whatever a Swede is, Beowulf is not that thing.
He's the anti-Swede.
He's the anti-Swede. That's right.
Unswede.
That's right.
It's Swedish.
It's written by a Christian monk, but the poem contains no New Testament references. And in fact, this has caused some people to go so far as to claim that the poem is not the product of a Christian imagination at all.
Oh, sure.
But rather that it was some kind of a Christianized, crypto-pagan story that then was sort of retold with this very thin Christian veneer over the top of it.
Yeah, I mean, you get that. You also get, that it's edited, that it was a pagan story and that it was edited. But then also, like, it's people who are officially Christian, but we know where their real sympathies lie.
Right. Exactly.
Yeah, exactly.
So, as I'm going to try to suggest in this episode, I think that idea is mainly, well, I thought of several different terms, but this is a family show. So I think that idea is mainly bunk. It's mainly stupid and silly, and it is certainly it comes about because as I've said, I said quite a bit when we were talking about the Grail a couple of episodes ago. Many medievalists and people who study these kinds of stories are actively disinterested in Christianity.
Which is, it
comes up.
I'm like speechless at this. Like I'm sputtering. Like it's just, how can you be a medievalist and not? I mean, whether you are a Christian or not, how can you not like know Christianity well and be a medievalist? Because it's just in everything in medieval.
So somebody
literature.
Was telling me the other day that they started listening to a podcast that you often recommend, Father, which is the Fall of Civilizations podcast.
Oh, sure.
And within the first 20 minutes of this particular episode, the narrator basically said, mentioned Christianity, was basically like introducing the Eastern Roman Empire, and mentioned Christianity and said, oh, well, Christianity is actually just this religion that was started as a resistance movement against Roman occupied Palestine, and Jesus was killed for resisting the Romans. And
I know.
I mean, this is,
it's an otherwise excellent podcast.
Otherwise excellent podcast, but
there's this howlers in there like that.
Yes.
Yeah.
So, but I mean, that's a good example, though, is like, this is a smart, intelligent person who's very well read and knowledgeable in other areas. But then when it comes to Christianity, it is almost as if one might say there are some kind of blinders of a spiritual nature.
Yeah, it's like, well, I think part of the problem is the way that religion is seen in the modern world, that it's this thing that you do, or an identity you have, almost like a very important hobby. And so it's like, well, we can analyze a whole society,
right,
even without talking about their religion, which that is possible on some level here in the 21st century, on some level. I don't think it's great. It's not really well done. Yeah. But anytime prior, I don't know, to the 20th century, it's ridiculous. It's utterly ridiculous. You can't understand a society without understanding what we would now call its religion. It's everywhere. It's just simply everywhere. It's in everything.
Yeah, so I think there's two things going on here. One is that these people very often just assume, they always assume bad faith. So you always assume if anybody says that they believe in whatever the prevailing religion at the time happens to be, that the reason cannot be that they are a sincere worshiper of God, or that they actually believe in the thing that their religion teaches. It has to be because it's about power dynamics, and it's the only reason anybody does this. It's I was moderating a panel once for a conference, and I got the sort of like the medievalist panel, and so I was moderating the panel, and there were some people that were talking about the Book of Marjorie Kemp. Is a medieval English, mystic, Roman Catholic mystic, and we were just, talking about, we were talking about, some of her visions and the way that Christ appeared to her and everything like this, and we're just having a very nice conversation about it, or at least I am with like one of the other people on the panel, and one of the other people on the panel starts freaking out because she realizes that we are speaking as though Christ actually does appear to people sometimes. and like, what? So she like registered a complaint about this. She was, I mean the whole panel was on mysticism. But she was like, there's all this Christian stuff, like there was all this, and I was like, listen, it's I don't know what to tell you. Right. So that's one thing, is that, and I'm not saying this is every academic, but it is definitely the prevailing climate.
Yeah, I mean, I have friends who go to the big medieval conference in Kalamazoo.
Yeah.
And they're like, there's open hostility to Christianity there.
Absolutely.
It's like, look, okay, if you're not Christian, whatever, I hope someday you become one, but it's just not even good scholarship.
Yeah,
it's just not. If you don't know it, if you're going to do medieval Europe.
So the second thing that goes on here then is that the things that people think they know about Christianity mainly come from initially like 19th century Protestantism, and nowadays more like 21st century evangelicalism.
Yeah.
And so if they come across something that looks to them like something other than 21st century evangelicalism, right, where they're not using the right words and they're not saying the right things, et cetera, then they'll say, oh, this has got to be some kind of a crypto-pagan thing because it doesn't look like the Christianity that I'm used to seeing. I mean, you'll even get people who will come across Trinitarian references and Trinitarian language and say, this has got to be some kind of crypto-polytheism, because to them, like, the Trinity is something that they were maybe told about like one time, but it's not a part of their actual experience of like faith or worship.
Sure. So whereas in contrast to historic Christian,
where it's kind of the whole thing,
which is Orthodox Christianity, Roman Catholicism, I would say especially Orthodox Christianity, frankly, that we pray to the Holy Trinity, that we pray to the Father, to the Son, to the Holy Spirit. We have a very clear sense of their personalities is probably not the right word, but their presences are distinct in their life of the church. Like, it's just everywhere, and I mean that's the reason why I've sometimes said, when I was an evangelical, and by the way, I should just say the evangelicalism that I came out of has morphed massively in the decades since. The evangelical, when I was an evangelical, I believed in the Trinity. And as an Orthodox Christian, I know the Trinity. I mean, that's maybe an extreme way to say it, but that's my personal experience. I'm not saying that's how it is for everybody.
So what I want to do over the course of this episode, and I want to do this in particular here because we're talking about these stories and telling them and we're talking about these stories to Orthodox Christians, or at least to an audience that's familiar with and sympathetic to Orthodox Christianity. If you're not any of those things, welcome. I don't know how you found us, but please stick around. We have water. We can, baptism is a thing that can be done, if you stick around long enough. So what we're going to try to show you today is that the kind of Christianity that produced the Beowulf poem is or the kind that the poet was steeped in is much, much closer to Orthodox Christianity. And in fact, Orthodox Christianity is really the only kind of Christianity which has still preserved many of the things on which the Beowulf poet would have drawn. And therefore, I would argue, Orthodox Christians who have never rejected the kind of literature that Beowulf was drawn from are uniquely primed to enjoy and appreciate this poem. Now, in the course of this episode, I am going to give the briefest of brief introductions to the Beowulf poem for those who have yet to read it. If you want to get my full analysis, and we're talking like line by line, I'll tell you every controversial word. We'll talk about the dating of Beowulf. I'll explain Calusa's law to you. If you want all of that stuff, I do have, as a bit of shameless self-promotion, I do have a course on Symbolic World Courses called Beowulf and Universal History. It is 18 hours long.
Shameless plug.
Shameless plug. It is 18 hours long. So I'm not going to do that today.
Yeah, this is not our introduction to Beowulf.
I think this will only take us maybe 9 hours tops today, what we're doing here. But no, so I'm going to give the briefest of brief introductions to just to get, so you have the plot in mind in case it's been a long time since you've read the poem. And then what we're going to do is focus in on the evidence for the surprising role of Enochian literature, I will explain that term, in Anglo-Saxon Christianity, and the Enochian connection, which is actually the missing connective tissue, in my opinion, between the various themes of the poem, and in particular, the three monster fights. And here's the spoiler for the end of the episode, is that Beowulf is the story of how one man settles the feud between God and the monsters. So I mentioned the Beowulf, I mentioned the three monster fights in the Beowulf poem. So very, very high-level overview. Okay, a long time ago in Denmark, there's a guy named Hrothgar. Hrothgar is a descendant of the Scyldings, which is the legendary but also historical ruling dynasty of the Danes.
Yeah, and this is taking place. Scyldsheving is the one who's mentioned at the very beginning of the poem. Right, and maybe he's a composite of two different figures, not important right now, but in any case, yeah, he's a legendary, mythical, historical culture figure, kind of a person, and Hrothgar is descended from him. And this is all set, by the way, there are figures like Hrothgar and Hygelac, who is Beowulf's uncle, and who we know absolutely for sure was a historical person. In fact, up until sometime in the Middle Ages, you could still go see his bones in Friesland, where he was killed. And by the way, according to everybody who went and saw his bones, he was a giant. Like a physically gigantic human being. Well, I mean, it is Friesland, which is part of the Netherlands, where everyone is like 6'7".
But Hygelac was not a Frieslander. He just died raiding in Friesland. But anyway,
maybe he is, and they're all from him.
Maybe.
And one of his raids is what gives rise. Just putting that out there.
Maybe, yeah. So in any case, the Danes, so Hrothgar, the king of the Danes, he decides to build a great mead hall. So the mead hall, this is the place where basically this is the center of cultural life in the Germanic Iron Age. All of this is set.
I was going to say, do the kids know what mead is?
Yeah, so mead is
mead is wine, everybody.
Honey
made
wine.
from
it's
honey
wine. It's
honey wine.
Yeah,
honey wine, and it's. I mean, one of the reasons why mead. Like so we're way out of the classical world now, everybody, where they're making wine out of grapes and all kinds of refined, high cultural things. When you're way the heck up north, grapes don't tend to grow super well. Although one of the clues that there was a medieval warming period,
right,
where the cult,
not just a conspiracy.
Yeah,
medieval warming really happened.
Yeah, it really happened.
Yeah,
there was climate change.
Yeah.
One of the evidences for this actually is the booming wine industry in England, of all places, indicating that it was
not traditionally known for its wine, but
way warmer than that at the time. But in any event, once you get far enough north and east, you don't really grow grapes, and for them, a lot of them, it didn't really.
Yeah.
It didn't occur to them. But what do you need to make wine? You basically just need some kind of sugary, fruity.
Yeah. So, and I will say actually, the earliest mead, like the earliest honey wine, is found in ancient Egypt. So, pretty much everybody that has honey has figured out you know what? We could ferment this. This would be great. We can make
this into a drink.
They have it.
Like there's an Ethiopian mead called Tej, which is very, very good and a little fizzy, at least the ones I've had.
Yeah.
But yeah, mead is, so this is the communal drink. It's used for drinking, and big drinking parties. But it's also sacrificial.
Drink. It's the king's drink, right? Because it is sacrificial. Most people in mead halls are drinking beer because honey is very expensive. Okay. But they don't. But it's the prestige associated with the mead, and then yes, it's also a religious thing, a sacrificial thing. Yeah. So you have the center right at this time in the Germanic Iron Age. Culture has gone from being sort of bog-based religion to being hall-based religion. And which is a big improvement for everybody, because when they were in the bogs, they were, drowning people to death. So it's a little better now. But in the hall, when the mead hall becomes the center of communal life, the central way that you would sort of experience life, and this is the ideal, this is paradise for them, are what they called the cella dreamas, the hall joys.
I mean, admit it, Richard, this is paradise for you and me too.
I mean, listen, not a lot has changed.
This is what we changed.
This is what we want. I mean, this is what's behind that sort of famous prayer of Saint Bridget, right? I wish I had, a lake of ale,
lake of beer,
so that I could feast the King of Kings, right? And then I would want the whole host of heaven to be there, and I would want Jesus Christ, and I would want the three Marys of great renown to all be feasting there, and I would want to be a rent payer to the King of Kings, so that when I was in trouble, I could ask for his aid, and he would come and help me. I mean, this is like an ancient Irish prayer, right? This is the idea that what heaven would be like is we're there together, and everybody's sort of sitting according to rank, and the food is flowing and the drink is flowing, and life is good.
Yeah,
and so these are the
this is the setting, right? This is the thing. This is the beautiful thing that is happening.
So when Hrothgar, so when Hrothgar builds his hall, Heorot, which means the heart, as in like the deer, when he builds the hall of Heorot, this is what this is a profoundly civilization founding act, and then he founds the hall, and things are going pretty well, and then along comes this monster named Grendel, and Grendel we'll talk about exactly what Grendel is. I'll save the big reveal for it in a minute, but let's say for now Grendel's something like a troll. He's a fierce, actually, which is like a marsh troll. And he comes and he begins raiding the Hall of Heorot each night after the sun goes down. Anybody he finds there, he eats and kills. And eventually, like everybody who stays to like fight him or stays to deal with him, they end up getting killed. And so 12 years go by. And during those 12 years, the Great Hall of Heorot stands empty, right? Which means there's no Cella Dreamas, there's no Hall Joys, things are bad, there's woe, there's sorrow at Hrothgar's court. And then we have, this character Beowulf who comes along. Now Beowulf is a Geat or a Geat. He's from Gotland in Sweden, what is now modern day Sweden, but he's not a Swede. And in fact, his father, Ecgtheow, in fact, usually in this poem, he's always Beowulf, son of Ecgtheow. Ecgtheow was feuding with the Swedes, and at some point, after having killed an important Swede, he had to get out of Dodge. And so when he was a young man, he came to Hrothgar's court. And Hrothgar basically gave him protection. I mean, this guy is like a powerful young, mercenary type. Definitely the sort of guy, like, if I give him protection, he'll do good stuff for me. And so Hrothgar, eventually settles his feud for him, and he's able to go back, and he marries the sister of the king of the Geats, who is Hygelac, who is Beowulf's uncle. So Beowulf is from this royal court. They had this feud with the Swedes, who are married into the Danish royal line at this time. So everything's a little complicated. But Beowulf basically hears about the feud that's about the monster that's raiding Heorot every night. And Beowulf, as a young man who, as we're going to find out, doesn't fit super well at his uncle's court, because he's a bear, basically. He's a bear man. That's what Beowulf probably means. Yeah,
he's what Tom Holland on the Rest is History podcast would call a massive lad.
Yeah, he is in fact a massive lad, and he's a full unit, as the kids would say. Yeah,
I've heard that one. Is that a zoomerism?
Yeah, it's a zoomerism. He's a unit, an absolute unit. I think that's the term actually. Absolute unit, Beowulf. So Beowulf, he gets on the he gets on his ship, and he comes across the swans riding to Heorot. And he gets there, and he comes in the door, and he says, basically, I'll be more than happy to solve this problem for you. And a bunch of people say, better men have tried. And there's a lot of very delicate words that go back and forth. And, you know, at some times the quest stands on the edge of a knife, so to speak. But eventually, Beowulf stays in the hall, and he says, I hear Grendel doesn't use any weapons or armor, so just to keep things fair, I won't use any weapons or armor either. So he takes off all of his clothes, takes off his armor, lays aside his weapons. This turns out to be really lucky because Grendel has spells cast on him, which prevent him from being harmed by weapons. However, Beowulf knows jujitsu. And so when Grendel comes in the hall, Beowulf gets him in an arm lock. I like to imagine this is a kimura, which is my favorite kind of arm lock. And definitely, if you applied enough force, you would indeed wrench somebody's shoulder out of their socket. And
it's only fair when Grendel comes in, on previous visits. Like one of the great things about this poem is it's so earthy and so direct. Like what you get is like the sounds of bones snapping and so forth, and he's crunching. Like it's very, very
Gobbets.
Graphic. Yeah. Big, globs of meat. Yeah. Grendel's basically a cannibal. He's eating people. You know. Yeah.
So much like Shia LaBeouf, actually. So Beowulf rips Grendel's arm off, and Grendel goes howling away back into the marsh, and nobody sees him ever again, except for.
And they hang the arm up in the rafters.
Yeah. So they hang the arm up in the rafters as a trophy, and then the next morning everybody's so happy because Heorot has been purged, and they've been rid of this scourge and all these things. Beowulf is just very humble and apologetic. He's like, I really hope to have like the whole monster here for you. All I have is his yes, Joe, I am a larger guy. Kimura is my favorite arm lock, and I have a whole Kimura trap system. It's my favorite thing in jiu-jitsu.
And there was much rejoicing.
I can get all kinds of stuff out of Kimuras. But anyway, okay. So I'm also a big arm triangle guy, which again is because I'm 6'4" and I weigh 220 pounds. So arm triangles are like, they're always right there. Anyway, all right. So also Nogi Ezekiel chokes, preferably from bottom mount, just to really troll the new guys. All right.
Apparently this is a wrestling podcast, but it's not professional wrestling.
It's always been a wrestling podcast.
What? I'm out.
The reason I don't have a Beowulf t-shirt on right now is because I am the Beowulf t-shirt. Right? Sometimes you just are the thing. Yeah. So, okay. So it seems like things are going to be good now, and they sing songs and they tell stories about other monster slayers, and it's all supposed to be very flattering and kind of compare, Beowulf to the big monster slayers from the legends and all these different. And then that night, Grendel's mother shows up, and Grendel's mother is she's actually a siren. She's a mirror wife. She's a she troll.
Yeah,
and she shows up.
A name in the story. She
doesn't have a name,
mother.
But she does have types, like monster names that are given to her. Mirror wife, which is basically like think of like a mermaid, but not half fish, half woman, but like a woman who lives at the bottom of a pool, right? The main
lake woman.
Yeah. So not distributing swords as a form of government. That was last episode, but in this episode she comes in. Yes, although in this episode she just comes in and immediately kills one of Hrothgar's bodyguards as basically as a payment, as a weregeld, a man price for her dead son.
Is this young Mr. Glove himself?
No, Glove Hansho is Beowulf's companion who got killed by Grendel. It's Ashura. Okay. It's Ashura, whose name means ash spear. He's the one who gets killed by Grendel's mother. And so the next morning, Beowulf finds out about this, and so he goes down to hunt Grendel's mother, and he hunts her into the marshes, and he hunts her into maybe actually the entrance to hell, as we'll talk about. And he gets there, and he goes down to the bottom of the mere, and he fights with her, and it's a much harder fight than the fight with Grendel. As it turns out, fighting monsters on their own turf, much harder. But eventually, he is able to find an ancient sword, the work of giants. And with it, he kills Grendel's mother and also cuts off the head of Grendel's corpse and then brings that back to civilization as a trophy. At this point, Beowulf just grows from strength to strength, so to speak. And eventually, he returns back home to his uncle Higelac, and his uncle dies, and then his cousin becomes the king, and then his cousin dies, and then Beowulf becomes the king. And Beowulf rules well over the Geats in peace and prosperity for 50 years until one came, a dragon, to rule. So somebody wanders, a slave one day wanders into a dragon's barrow, finds a golden cup there, steals it, brings it back to his master, hoping this will save him the beating that he's going to be due. And the dragons, of course, dragons always know when you've stolen the treasure. The dragon wakes up and begins to ravage Beowulf's kingdom. And so Beowulf has no choice but to go and fight the dragon, which he does. He goes and he fights the dragon, and all of his companions desert him except for one. And eventually, with the help of his companion, Beowulf manages to kill the dragon, but in the process, he is mortally wounded and dies. And the very end of his story is they take all the treasure from the dragon's hoard, and instead of redistributing it to the rest of Beowulf's people, it's all put into Beowulf's treasure mound. Beowulf's body is burned. The women of the Geats wail, and heaven swallows the smoke.
And
now, I've just...
A ring of horses around the...
Yes.
The
I've just
pyre.
summarized...
That's my favorite bit.
Like 3,000 lines of Old English poetry. And it is a wonderful and complex narrative. And there's a ton more there that I didn't tell you about. But just to give you a kind of a sense of that's what the story is. Hopefully people who are listening to this are familiar enough. Otherwise, if you're not, you can pause this, go listen to Beowulf. Welcome back. I said listen to. Go read Beowulf, listen to it, whatever. Welcome back. So what I want to talk about now is what's the Enoch of it all. So, do you want to read this first? This is what our first description of Grendel. All of our quotes today will be from the R.M. Liudza translation, which you can get on Amazon. It is the translation of Beowulf, which I recommend, and it's the one that most philologists will recommend, and it's the one that I use to teach. So, So, do you want to go ahead and read this description, this first description we get of Grendel?
Of Grendel. A bold demon who waited in darkness wretchedly suffered all the while, for every day he heard the joyful din loud in the hall, with the harp sound, the clear song of the shope. He said, who is able to tell of the origin of men, that the Almighty created the earth, a bright and shining plain by seas embraced. This grim spirit was called Grendel, mighty stalker of the marches, who held the moors and fens. This miserable man lived for a time in the land of giants, after the Creator had condemned him among Cain's race. When he killed Abel, the eternal Lord avenged that death. No joy in that feud. The Maker forced him far from mankind for his foul crime. From thence arose all misbegotten things, trolls and elves and the living dead, and also the giants who strove against God for a long time. He gave them their reward for that.
So, the thing that makes Grendel come and begin to attack Heorot is that he hears the sound of the harpers, and he hears the song that the harper, the shope, is singing. Shope, by the way, means the person who shapes things, which is the Old English word for poet.
Yeah, poet, singer, bard.
Yeah, skald, which is that SC in Old English, which sounds like an SH in modern English, is in Old Norse became sk. So in fact, anytime there's an SK word in English, just so people know, anytime there's an SK word in English, that word came from Old Norse. That's why we have ship and skipper, right? The ship
and
is
skirt and shirt.
Yes, yeah, which are all actually this, like ship and skipper, right? Actually, the same word. shirt and skirt, also actually the same word.
And I assume ska, like ska bands, also are some kind of Norse.
Yeah, there's no way to be sure. There's no way to be sure. So the thing that he hears is the sound of the shope, and the sound of the shope is very clearly the Genesis narrative of creation, right?
Yeah,
the origin of men, that the Almighty created the earth, a bright and shining plain by seas embraced, etc.
Yeah, which is one of the, I mean, this is one of the big themes in Old English poetry, is the creation of the world.
Right.
Shows up again and again, of course, very famously in Caedmon's hymn, one of the most, probably the earliest piece of English poetry, very, very popular. And this is what Grendel hates. It's not just that they're having a great time. He hates this story because it's like, wait a minute.
It's the story
they're singing about when my ancient ancestors got trashed by God.
Right. So the Anglo-Saxons, they had their own alliterative verse retelling. It's called the based on an early Old Saxon exemplar. They had their own alliterative verse retelling of Genesis. It's usually called Genesis A, Genesis B, because there's two different manuscripts. But it's really just like the one Anglo-Saxon Genesis narrative. And I think it would be really fair to say that Genesis and Proverbs are the two most popular books of the Bible as far as the Anglo-Saxons are concerned. Anglo-Saxons are super into wisdom literature. So we're first provided here with a first bit of connective tissue between the old pagan world and the Christian inheritance of the Beowulf poet. Both of these inheritances speak of this war with of the Most High God with giants, right? Which is is a dominant theme of all Indo-European mythologies, but it's also a very important part of the Genesis story, especially the Genesis story as it was traditionally understood by Christians, right? The sons of God who come and they have offspring with the daughters of men, and those are the giants, the mighty men of renown, etc., that you find in Genesis chapter 6. Now, at this point, maybe Father Andrew, you want to explain to people that there are essentially two different traditional readings. They're both quite old.
Yeah,
essentially two different traditional readings of this story.
Exactly. So, one way of reading this idea of the sons of God and the daughters of men producing these giants is that the sons of God are angels, fallen angels. And of course, this comports with the way that the phrase sons of God is used pretty much everywhere else in the Bible, actually. So for instance, in Job, I think it's chapter 38, it talks about when the creation of the world is happening, that the sons of God shout for joy, that they're singing and so forth. And so that's clearly these are the angels at the creation of the world. And so the idea then is that there is some kind of union, and we don't need to get into all of the details of this. Actually, I'm going to talk about this a little bit more later, but there's some kind of union between these fallen angels and women, and they produce these giants. Now, from a pagan point of view, these are basically demigods. This would be the understanding of how that works. And this is represented in Second Temple Jewish literature. It's represented especially in the church fathers of the earliest centuries of the church. Another almost as old, as far as I can tell, not quite as old, but almost as old reading is what's called the Sethite view or Sethite hypothesis. And that's the idea that the sons of God are descendants of Seth. Because if you remember, in Genesis, you get this sort of split between two different genealogies. You get the genealogy of Cain, right? And this is all in Genesis chapter 4. And then you get the genealogy of Seth, who is the other son of Adam and Eve after Abel dies, after Abel is murdered by Cain. And so then sons of God, then this phrase would represent, this sort of righteous set of humans, some of them then intermarrying with daughters of Cain, so to speak, right. Not necessarily literal daughters, but his descendants, and that produces then these Nephilim is the word that's actually used in the Hebrew right. Bible, although it's actually not a Hebrew word. It's from Aramaic, I think, originally. But so those are kind of the two views. Yeah, I could talk about that for hours and hours, but I'm just trying to summarize it.
There is another podcast people can check out.
There's another podcast.
If they're curious. The Lord of Spirits episode in the Land of Giants, which is like 8 hours long or something.
Something like that.
Anyway, it's that's the sort of like the definitive thing that people could go listen to if they're curious about all of that. So the poet who wrote the Anglo-Saxon Genesis, basically follows a Sethite hypothesis. And so what he has is that the giants and the other monsters also originate from the unholy coupling of the descendants of Seth, that is the sons of God, with the descendants of Cain, that is the daughters of men. And this seems to be actually something that they have maybe inherited from Syrian apocryphal works. I have talked about this in some universal history episodes in the past, but the earliest place that the Sethite hypothesis appears is in like some of the Syrian apocryphal writings. However, if we take a look at those, what you'll actually find is that there's actually in the Syrian apocryphal tradition, there is actually a ritual dimension to this coupling. It takes place via music, and specifically certain kinds of music produced by certain kinds of musical instruments, and then also cosmetics and also seductive arts. These three things, which all go together, which are taught to the daughters of Cain by the demons. And so it's actually not just that it's just a normal human coupling. Even in the Sethite hypothesis in the Syrian tradition, it's still there's a ritual component, and a demon is involved in some way, which has always led me to feel like probably the two different versions are much closer than people realize in the modern world.
Yeah. I mean, again, go listen to that Giants episode in Lord of Spirits for all of the details here. And I mean, I'm going to give a little bit when I talk about the sword a little bit later. I'm going to introduce some of those things then too.
Yeah. So the famous antiquarian M.R. James said that the Anglo-Saxons were in possession of a good deal of rather rare apocryphal literature. And certainly by the standards of, early modern Western Europe, that was true. So there are Syrian connections, a very strong Syrian connection to a very strong connection to the Syrian East. And Anglo-Saxon Christianity came through Saint Theodore of Tarsus, who is one of the very first archbishops of Canterbury. And he was a Syrian monastic, and who came there and became, the archbishop. But he brought with him a bunch of different Syrian customs and poetry and martyrologies. This is why if you read old English martyrologies, there's a bunch of random Syrian martyrs in there, which you don't find anywhere else in Western Europe. Also, probably the sort of the cross as the tree of life imagery that you find in the Dream of the Rood, right? Has this. I mean, that's a very strong theme in Syrian theology as well. So there's that Syrian strain, but there is also the fact that the Anglo-Saxons, and we can now prove this, had access to the Book of Enoch.
Okay.
Now,
prove it to me, Richard.
I will prove it to you. It's very simple.
With many infallible proofs.
Yes, many infallible proofs. So there's one surviving fragment written in Latin. It was a Latin translation of the Book of Enoch from the Old English period. In fact, it dates to the same century as the likely authorship of Beowulf. Now, asterisk next to that, because the dating of Beowulf itself is highly controversial, but the only people who want to argue with you about it have never gotten just an actual date with a girl. So don't even try to date Beowulf, as far as I'm concerned. But I would typically very conservatively usually date the Beowulf poem to about the age of Bede, and this Latin fragment is certainly dates to that same period, if not a little bit earlier. It even comes from the same kind of region that Beowulf was likely written in, which was this very large monastic center with a big library, lots of copies of things being made. And fortunately, in the Anglo-Saxon redaction of Enoch, we actually, one of the part of the surviving fragment does include this treatment here, this treatment of the Nephilim. So some from the heights of heaven departed from the world of the word of the Lord. They beget on earth giants, not according to the spirit, but according to the flesh, and there will be great punishment on the earth. There's a lot of language, by the way, in the Beowulf poem and elsewhere in Old English stuff. For instance, the Old English poem Solomon and Saturn, which really talks about the ways that demons attack and torment us. talks about the demonic origins of metalworking. For instance, that's explicitly in Solomon, Saturn, and kind of there by implication also in the Beowulf poem, all of which matches this Enochian language. Now, I think I mentioned already the sort of the Syriac account, right? The descendants of Seth. In the Syriac version, the descendants of Seth still live on the mountain of paradise, but they live outside the gates of paradise. So they kind of like live on the slopes of paradise, but they're not quite down in the world. And then Cain and his descendants camp, basically around the base of the mountain. And so when the sons of God come down to take wives of the daughters of men, it's still you could say like a descent down the ontological ladder. There's still demons involved, etc. And so, which theory does the Beowulf poet take? Well, we can assume that it is possible, I would say even probable, that the Beowulf poet had access to the Book of Enoch. There's a lot more evidence of this connection in the poem, actually, than there is that he had access to the Germanic myths and legends that everybody takes for granted he had access to. There are passages in here that are going to be almost, there are lines in the Beowulf poem that are almost direct quotes from the Book of Enoch or from other Christian apocryphal writings.
Yeah.
And whereas, but people, because they're disinterested in those things, or because they assume that Christianity would reject all of those writings outright. And it should be said, in the late medieval West and in the modern period, almost all these apocryphal writings were completely rejected by the Roman Catholic Church, and therefore also by Protestantism. And so that has again, people make this assumption that, hey, the Christianity that these guys had is actually just like the Christianity that I grew up with. So if I say, well, Christians don't consider the Book of Enoch part of the Bible, what people end up doing then is sort of assuming, and therefore it could never have influenced any Christian literature whatsoever.
Right, which makes like the only evidence you need to debunk that, although there's a lot of things, but the only evidence you need to debunk that is the fact that the only reason we have the Book of Enoch is because Christians kept copying it and keeping it, and like if there's this utter rejection from day one, they would not have done that, because absolutely there was a tendency of saying, okay, if this writing is bad, we're not going to keep it at the very least, and we might even burn it or something like that, so people don't have access to it. But no, it gets copied again and again. It gets used again and again. That's the problem. Like, so Beowulf is, I think the dating I think you go for is that it's like 8th century, whatever. Yeah. I mean, this is Christianity from 1300 years ago.
Right.
That's a long time, and a lot of things have happened since then.
It's a long time, and even though Enoch was rejected a little bit earlier than that in the Latin West, or at least proscribed for reading, we know that copies persisted, especially in the British Isles. I mean, there's no Twitter where you can just check and see like what's the Holy Father thinking today, and so sometimes these things would get banned, and maybe the order just never makes it to that one particular monastery in Ireland. Yeah. But maybe also like, they get the order and they're like, eh.
Yeah, or they're like, okay, we'll just make sure it's not on the front of the shelf when the bishop comes around.
Right, exactly.
Kind of thing.
Now, what we're going to see is that actually the use of the apocrypha is actually much more pervasive than that these aren't just texts that were being preserved in monasteries, but they are texts which people were using to write homilies for lay people from. And I'll give you some specific examples of that in a moment, but all of this to say, the Beowulf poet is certainly familiar with all of this kind of stuff, right? And although he doesn't commit to one or other of the hypotheses, there are various Enochic references throughout the poem, which we'll continue to share as we go. I think that they suggest that he leans more in that direction, right? So most of the facts that are provided, for instance, that the monsters are descended from Cain, that they were destroyed by God in the Great Flood, etc., could be true of either one, but I think that a lot of the explicitly demonic language that is used about Grendel, which, by the way, probably includes Grendel's name. Grendel... the first part of it is like a pretty normal Anglo-Saxon, could be like grind, something like that. but the el ending is not a way that a normal Anglo-Saxon name ends.
No. Yeah, I'm just thinking through.
Think about it. It
English names.
And so some scholars have suggested, and when I say some scholars, I mean like one scholar that I know of has suggested, but I think there's like a good argument to be made that if you just look at how do all of the demons' names end in Enoch, well, they all end with an L.
Yeah, they all have these theophoric
it's like,
names.
Yeah, it's a theophoric name.
El means God in Semitic languages.
Yeah, and so Grendel's name seems to be the Anglo-Saxon word for something like grind or destruction, that kind of an idea, with this little Semitic theophoric ending on the end in imitation of what you would find in the Latin translation of the Book of Enoch that the poet would have been familiar with. So it seems to tip things in that direction in the Book of Enoch, I think. If you look at the different monster words in the Beowulf poem, you have Eotens, right, which are like ogre, monster, troll, or
giant,
Germanic, giants of Germanic mythology, right?
And Enta is I think just another form of that, or
that's right.
We get the word Ent,
Yes, right, exactly. Yes, you have the Ilf, the elves, Orkneas, which is from Latin orcus, which is literally a spirit, like a corpse-eating spirit, the unclean spirit of the dead, a zombie, something like that. That's actually what Tolkien says. He says it's a zombie. It's the only time that I've ever found him use that word. It's pretty exciting.
Yeah, and I mean, Orkneas is where he gets the word orc.
But also, the Beowulf poet uses the word gigantas.
Yeah, which is just straight up Greek.
Which is specifically the word for like Old Testament giants. And so he uses his words, and then he uses these Old Testament, maybe Book of Enoch words for giants, and he kind of mashes the two together. So he sort of says, hey, actually those monsters in my not his native mythology, but like his grandfather's native mythology, those monsters, and then the monsters of the Old Testament in the Book of Enoch, those things are actually the same.
Yeah, so he's doing a little universal history, basically.
Yeah, exactly. And again, great course, Beowulf in Universal History, if you want to get some more into this.
Wow.
Yeah, there you go. One of the main things that's going on in the poem is kind of the question of like, what do you do with your virtuous pagans? Right? And so it seems like the Beowulf poet is certainly a soft liner when it comes to virtuous pagans. Obviously, Beowulf, not a baptized Christian, but we're really meant to come away with the idea that he's this pretty friendly, we're to think of him sympathetically. The way that he puts it is that the King of Heaven, and we'll get to why I think he says this, but the King of Heaven is going to have no reason to complain about Beowulf when Beowulf.
Yeah, and why? Okay, you're the Christian writer of Beowulf, the Beowulf poem, excuse me, and why would you want to essentially put these pagans into a virtuous light? Okay, so it's the 8th century. How long have old Anglo-Saxons been Christian? Not long. It's just been a couple of 2 or 3 generations.
Yeah, probably like 2 generations by the time this is written.
So that means, right, that grandparents, great-grandparents, definitely great-grandparents are pagans.
Yeah.
And you're in a culture like this, you're not going to be trashing your elders. You're not going to be trashing the people you're descended from. That's not how this works.
So, and I just want to emphasize the thing that I'm trying to show is it's not that, in case this wasn't clear from the beginning, I feel like maybe I didn't say this as succinctly as I wanted to. So let me try again. Nowadays, when people read the Beowulf poem, they sort of say, oh, well, he had some generally Christian morals, and then he just imported all the monsters from Germanic paganism. And what I'm trying to show is that what he was doing is actually much more interesting and complex than that, which is to say, he looked at the monsters from Germanic paganism and he said, actually, these things are there. There is an answer for these things in the Christian story. There's an answer for where the monsters come from in the Christian story, right? The whole idea that monsters are descended from Cain is not something the Beowulf poet came up with himself.
No,
that is a common Christian belief that goes back to the Book of Enoch.
Yeah. Well, I mean, it stems from this idea that Cain is like the father of all sin, or the father of sinners in any event, right?
And certainly, he's very importantly, the first kinslayer.
Yeah, he's the first kinslayer. He's the one who teaches sin. Like, that's how he's depicted in traditional texts, as the one who and that's why he's also described as being the first heretic, because he's the one who he's teaching sin. You know, so he's not like a demonic origin of sin, but he's the one that through whom sin is really coming into the world. You know, he's going around spreading it. Like, he's, you know, everybody else's granddads are trying to teach them how to be virtuous, decent people, and Cain is like, you know, come on, kids, come on, grandkids, I'm going to give you some more evil. Like, that's how he's depicted, right?
Right.
Father of monsters.
Yeah. So Cain's chief sin is kinslaying, right? Which in the world of the heroic Germanic Iron Age is the worst kind of crime you can possibly commit. It's the worst taboo there is, because it is the thing which more than anything else causes the society to cease to cohere.
Yeah,
because
it strikes at the foundation of your whole world.
Because the way that justice is enacted is basically through the mechanism of the feud. So the idea is, if somebody from your family comes and kills somebody in my family, now what I have to do is even the scales by I get a posse together, hunt down somebody from your family, and I kill them. Right? And at that point, we're even. So at that point, if you decide to keep it going, well, that's on you, man. Obviously, you're going to keep it going because you're like, wait a minute, this guy just killed one. And so there's the feud, and it sounds barbaric, but a lot of times the feuds did work out. Like, you know, it wasn't just for big stuff; it was for little things like, okay, we're out working in the field one day, and a bunch of, you know, some of your farmers and some of your shepherds, some of my shepherds got into a disagreement. There was a fight. A guy got his eye poked out. Well, what are you going to do? How are you going to reinstitute justice in this situation? Well, either I get to poke the eye out of one of your guys, or you guys need to basically compensate. And this is basically ultimately where our whole idea of like tort comes from. You got to basically compensate my guy for his lost eye. Like, how much harder is his life going to be with only one eye as a shepherd? So you got to pay me something to make up for that, right? And so this idea of being paid for something is called a weregeld, or a man price, right? Which is what that means, like the man gold, the man price. And so you would pay the man price, and it wasn't always just for like killing. It could be for various different kinds of things. And the idea is that it's supposed to balance the scales. That's the idea. So kinslaying, well, if one of your sons kills one of your other sons, well, now who is there to feud with? Like, at that point, you're just destroying your own house. And so this is why kinslaying is like the worst kind of, it's the worst possible thing you can do in the society. So much so that Beowulf even talks about this, like, there's no sorrow greater than the sorrow of a father whose children fight among each other, because it doesn't matter which side you take, there's never going to be any chance of justice, right? So Cain's chief sin is kinslaying, which makes him the father of these monsters. And I think the implication is not just that Grendel and his mother are the kin of Cain because they're biologically descended from Cain, but rather that those who participate in kinslaying become the children of Cain.
Yeah, it's just like, if you're among the faithful, then you are a child of Abraham. Doesn't matter if you're genealogically descended from Abraham. That's what makes you a son of Abraham, is you do Abraham's works. That's what makes you a child of God, is you do God's works. This is what makes you a child of Cain, is that you do Cain's works. Right.
So to give another example of the way that this, what I'm calling Enochian literature, and we could kind of widen the scope a little bit if you wanted to, and say it's apocryphal literature, Christian apocryphal literature. The Book of Enoch is kind of the source for a bunch of this stuff, to use a repetitive phrase. And so because of that, you know, a lot of times it's called Enochian literature. It's also sometimes called apocryphal literature. So after Beowulf kills Grendel, we get one of the many songs within the song, right? One of the many poems within the poem. And what we have is that the Shope of Hrothgar's court, to celebrate Beowulf's great fighting of a monster, he tells another monster killing story. Now, in this case, he tells the story of Sigemund the Volsung. Now, if you're thinking, wait a minute, wasn't it Sigurd who fought the dragon? In the later version of the story, it is. But the earliest reference to the story of the Volsungs is actually in Beowulf. I'm not going to summarize the Volsung
I didn't know,
thing.
actually. I will say, I'm going to promise everybody, we will do the Volsunga saga.
Yeah. It's a dark one. It's a dark one.
Oh, yes.
We'll do Volsunga saga. Interestingly enough, Dr. Martin Shaw says that's the story. Since he became a Christian, that's the story he can't tell anymore.
It's too tough. It's a rough one.
It's a tough one. It's a tough one. All right, so I'm not going to explain the Volsunga Saga thing, but basically the Volsunga Saga has the story of Sigurd killing Fafnir the dragon. It's the most famous dragon slaying story in Germanic tradition, and obviously it's the source of like Wagner's Ring cycle, and fat ladies with horns on their heads. And kill the wabbit, kill the wabbit.
Okay, since you mentioned that, since you cracked that open, I'm sorry. I just have to give a plug for a film that is very, very unknown. And so there's a film called Sing Faster. And Sing Faster is the tale. It's a documentary, really. Actually, it's a documentary of the ring cycle. Which, if you know the ring cycle, it takes, I think, isn't it five evenings to actually watch the whole thing? Because it's like 12, 15 hours long or something like that. Well, Sing Faster. And they only say 3 sentences the whole time. It's amazing. I know. Sing Faster is about the experience of doing that opera from the point of view of the stagehands. And so you can see, as a former stagehand,
this is a little specific, I think.
Isn't it? But it's really great. And the reason why it's called Sing Faster is because, the stagehands are really toughing it out and having, it takes a long time to do this show. Most shows, you do them and you send them out the door, that night. And so at one point, one of the stagehands, who is called Spike, he says he's talking about one of his fellow stagehands is dating one of the Rhine maidens, and they're like, okay, we're in day 3 of this. We need to get this over with. Come on, let's move that set piece. Can you sing a little faster? Let's get this over with. So I just have to say, as a former stagehand, it's a very little known thing, but it's out there somewhere. I think you can buy the DVD. Watch Sing Faster, the Stagehands Ring Cycle. It's so very fun. And you can get a tiny little look into what my life used to be like.
It's probably funnier if you were a stagehand.
Maybe.
I feel like this is like one of those movies that people make about people who make movies. This is like,
no,
who's this for? Not me.
It's good. Stagehands are basically the dwarves. Like they're the dwarves, the dark, the dark elves, which is kind of the same thing.
Not heroes.
No, they're but anyway, I just want to.
All right.
Well, that'll probably come up again when we do Volsunga Saga.
Well, listen. That's the only movie recommendation you're going to get today, because there's never been a good film adaptation of Beowulf made.
No,
so
there has
really
not.
recommend that you just don't.
No, they're all horrifyingly bad.
Yeah.
Don't do it.
All right, so Sing Faster. There you go, guys. Well, the earliest attested reference to the Lay of the Volsungs, the Volsunga Saga, comes in Beowulf. And at this point, Sigurd, as a character, is not even a twinkle in the eyes of his father/uncle. So in the earliest version of the story, it is Sigemund who kills the dragon. So we get the story here, we get the account, and this, of course, foreshadows the dragon slaying at the end of the Beowulf poem, when Beowulf will also slay a dragon with the aid of a younger kinsman. Beowulf and Sigemund are both contrasted with a guy named Heremod, who is an evil king whose death and deposition basically brought about the interregnum that shield shaving was sent by God to heal. So he's the archetypical bad king. And so Beowulf and Sigemund are both contrasted with him in this favorable way. And in both the stories, the details aren't given. So the story of Heremod, the story of Sigemund, the details of the stories are not given because the poet refers to them, but expects you to know the details. And this is actually kind of a form, you could say, of active audience participation, because basically he's like, mentions this other story that you know, and then he invites you to remember it even as he keeps on telling the story. And the Beowulf poem is so full of these things. There are what are called the episodes, and then there are what are called the what is it, the episodes and the, gosh darn it, what's the other word?
You tell me.
I'll think of it in a second. But in Beowulf studies, basically there are these the episodes and the digressions. The episodes and the digressions. So the digressions are when somebody is talking and then they tell a story within the story, and then the episodes are where we get like a whole flashback kind of a thing. So the episodes and the digressions are some of the most there's some of the, you know, it's one of the things that makes Beowulf the hardest to read, because you, as a modern person, you're coming along and you're like, well, exactly what is the necklace of the Brosings? Again, go watch my course if you're curious about that. But like, exactly what is the necklace of the Brosings, and exactly like what is a Finnsburg, and what's the fight that happened there, and why does that what does that have to do with anything else in the story?
Yeah, I mean, one of the difficult things about Beowulf is that there's so many allusions and short little bits from other stuff. It can be really bewildering, you know, like, but just give me the giants and the dragon.
But also it's what makes it kind of fun.
I know. I'm just saying,
is that you can spend your life kind of to tracing these. Okay, so again, all the Beowulf scholarship knows about the episodes. I said it wrong, but the episodes are like, that's the main story, like the Grendel fight with Grendel's mother, dragon. Those are the episodes, and then the digressions. Anyway, everybody knows about everybody in Beowulf studies knows about the episodes and the digressions, and that it's full of these broken references, or these references that obviously we're not broken for the audience. Like the poet intends the audience to understand the references to these things when he mentions them. And they know that exists for Germanic paganism. But because they do not know things about Old English Christianity, they don't recognize it when the Beowulf poet does the same thing. And in fact, he has to do it a little more carefully, because he's deliberately setting his story in sort of, you could say, Old Testament times. And so it is still full of these biblical allusions and references, but people don't understand what they are and when they're coming in. So just to give an overview real quick of the role of the apocrypha in Anglo-Saxon preaching. Why do I mention preaching? Because if the Beowulf poet expects his audience to know these references, and we have to assume his audience is probably either other lay monks or it's common people. So if he expects them to know these references, then these references have to be to stories and accounts that are part of, you could say, like popular culture, right? Which you know, many people can't read. Even people who can read do not own their own copies of the scriptures, let alone things like the Book of Enoch or the Proto-Evangelium of James or something like that. Yeah. So the way that most people would encounter the scriptures and these other things, the apocryphal writings, would be through the Anglo-Saxon homiletic tradition. So this is back in the day when a guy who was a good priest was not necessarily also expected to be a good preacher. And so typically speaking, which, you know, might not be the worst assumption now, I'm just saying, but in any case,
when St. Raphael of Brooklyn was ministering in Syria, he was appointed as a preacher for his diocese, meaning that most clergy were not preaching.
And so what they did in the Middle Ages, and they've done this lots of places in the Orthodox world, you know, in the East as well. But what they would do is you'd have like a cathedral or like a large monastic center, or in the case of medieval England, those two things are always the same. And what they would do is they would produce a book of homilies for the year. Yeah. And it would have like a homily for each Sunday, and then it would have homilies for all the major feasts, like the major Christian feasts. So, and then they would distribute those to the clergy. And so then, you know, you do the mass, and then the clergyman, the priest would read a homily, or somebody in the community would read a homily from the homilary book. And these are incredibly valuable to us, because they have preserved all of these apocryphal references, where it becomes extremely clear that even lay people in medieval England were more familiar with the apocrypha than modern Christians are today.
Yeah, because they were hearing it in sermons in church.
And I have a map, and I don't know if the map is actually part of our slides or not, but I have a map of basically all of the apocryphal references that people have traced in the Anglo-Saxon homilary tradition, and there's a lot of stuff in here.
It's crazy.
It includes things like if you look at the map, it's a little like, really? I haven't even read most of these. What do you like? It includes things like the Proto-Evangelium of James, which is a very important, you know, text in the Orthodox tradition. gives the account of the early life of the Mother of God. It's an important primary source for things like her nativity, her entry into the temple, and so forth.
Yeah.
And then along those same lines, it includes the Transitus Mariae, which is an account of her Dormition, which was probably originally written in the 2nd or 3rd century. I think we got it up on the...
Yeah, the map is up.
Yeah,
so,
that's good. The text may be too small for people to read at home, but this is just to give you a sense of how well attested the apocrypha is in the Anglo-Saxon homilary tradition. And there's a great book called Preaching the Apocrypha in the Anglo-Saxon Tradition that you can just go buy on Amazon and just read about all this stuff. Like, this is not secret sources. You can just go read this book. But there's the Transitus Mariae, which is written originally in the 2nd or 3rd century and is one of the most widely disseminated texts in the ancient Christian world. There's and then of course, the Gospel of Nicodemus, another very important work in the Orthodox tradition, which is the source of the harrowing of hell narratives, which is a mainstay of the Old English Paschal celebration. They had their own alliterative verse rewriting of the Gospel of Nicodemus, which they used as part of their Holy Saturday liturgy.
Awesome.
Which is so rad.
Yeah,
it's just so rad. And then the most important of these texts for our purposes is probably one called the Visio Pauli, or the Apocalypse of St. Paul. This is a work of ascetic literature, was composed in a Pacomian monastery in Egypt before the year 400 AD, so we're solidly like in Orthodox territory, right?
Yeah.
Major influences are the Book of the Watchers from First Enoch, the Apocalypse of Zephaniah, 4th Esdras, which is maybe also 3rd Esdras. Don't get me started on like how do you number the Esdrases, because legitimately I can never remember, because like 4th is maybe also 2nd, I think is what it is.
This is when we should bring Father Stephen.
Yeah. I mean, by the way, it's, if you haven't like read 4th Esdras, it's incredibly rad.
Yes.
And then also the Apocalypse of Peter.
It's my favorite Esdras, really.
Yeah, it's really, yeah. So the Visio Pauli is a work of ascetic literature. It focuses mainly on like monks and how their judgments are going to differ from those of other Christians. If I read this text, it would make me not want to be a monk. Now, handily, I already am not a monk, so that works out. But it's basically, it's like, oh yeah, like normal married people raising their families, yeah, they all get into heaven. But monks, man, let me tell you about monks. Here's all the tortures of hell prepared for monks who do not live obedient to their spiritual father and their monastic rule and all this stuff. It's very, very rigorous writing. It seems to have been very well known in Christian Europe, even in the West, in the first half of the Middle Ages. It is, in particular, it's a very influential step in the genre that eventually leads to the Divine Comedy, which we'll talk about one of these days. And it seems to have been copied more than once in Anglo-Saxon England. There is one copy that still survives to us, but there are several indications that lots of other copies were made.
Now, these are in Latin, probably?
Yes.
Certainly,
but,
yeah.
Well, actually, no. We know for sure that there was a vernacular copy.
Oh, so in Old English?
Yes. And the reason that we know for sure is that both the Blickling homily number 16, which I will talk about in a moment, both the Blickling homily number 16 and the Beowulf poem directly quote a common source. But for various reasons, they can't be quoting each other.
Okay.
And the common source is a vernacular version of the Visio Pauli. And there is a pretty good monogram that somebody has published on this called Following the Formula, which is one of these academic books that you have to pay like $120 or something to get a cheap paperback copy of.
Right.
But it's very recent scholarship that's really just come out and has really kind of blown the lid off of Beowulf studies in a really big way, which is really great. So it has 3 features that connect it closely to the Beowulf poem. So keep in mind what I've just been saying about the dragon slayers, right? So there's language in the there's language in the Visio Pauli which is used to refer to Saint Michael, which the Beowulf poet uses to refer to Beowulf. That's thing 1.
Okay.
Thing 2, is the description of hell, and particularly the use of the formula. We'll talk about this. What is a formula in Anglo-Saxon poetry? The use of the formula Hoar Stone or Hoar Stone, Hoar, like the old stone, the gray stone.
Yeah.
And then also the emphasis on pride as the primary sin that you have to watch out for, which is the whole theme of the Visio Poli, and is also the whole theme of Beowulf. It's literally the very middle of Beowulf, by line count, is a homily delivered by Hrothgar.
Yeah.
And it is a homily on the dangers of pride, which is basically taken from the Visio Poli.
Wow. Yeah, I've heard it called Hrothgar's homily before, and I was like, and it is kind of. I mean,
it's absolutely
just on its face, but it makes sense. It's not an unreasonable thing to call it. Yeah.
So there's these mentions. There's these mentions of the description of hell, and particularly the Hoar Stone, the old stone, right? So these old stones, these are boundary stones that are associated with the old pagan culture, with fairies, etc. They're not infrequently found in England, especially like near the Black Marsh in Shropshire. You can go look on Wikipedia.
I feel like the Black Marsh in Shropshire is like a very Monty Python.
I know, right? I know.
And all the way to the Black Marsh in Shropshire.
Yes. They're usually dated back to the Neolithic period, but nobody really knows when they were set up or by whom they were set up, etc. They're often found near, but the important thing is that they're often found near bogs and marshes, which of course is where the monsters come from.
Yeah.
So in the Anglo-Saxon Visio Poli, in the Anglo-Saxon epic Andreas, which is about the life of St. Andrew, yes.
I have to give a big plug for that. It's about how St. Andrew saved St. Matthew. My brother's name is Matthew. Saved St. Matthew from an island of cannibals. And very often depicted with dogs' heads in art, by the way. We should do that poem sometime.
We totally will. We totally will. There's not. I mean, it's incomplete as most surviving Anglo-Saxon poems are, but we will definitely do it. All right. So in Andreas and Blickling homily number 16. So the Blickling homilies is one of these collections of homilies we were talking about, and in the Beowulf poem. In all of these different texts, this word Hoar Stone, these old stones, are used to denote a border from which the monsters come, and across which heroes must journey in order to defeat the monsters. So there's a lot of examples of this. Sigemund in Beowulf fought the dragon by the Hoar Stone, and it's always under Hoar Stone in Old English, but under doesn't just mean under; it can mean beside or beyond, it's a very broad. It's kind of an all-purpose preposition. The mere where Grendel and his mother dwell is found beyond the Hoar Stone. And then, very importantly, the dragon's lair is located under the Hoar Stone. And what's really fun also is that in the Beowulf poem, as well as in other things like The Ruin, which is a fragmentary Anglo-Saxon poem about ruins, the Hoar Stone is associated with, and it's always paired with, the work of giants.
Enter your work.
So I want to just read a little bit from the Blickling homily here, and then we can talk about Grendel's mother and the sword. And we're doing great on time. This is going to be fine. It's going to be fine. Okay, so let me read this. This is an Enochian Anglo-Saxon description of hell from the Blickling homily. Let us now bid. By the way, this is the homily for Michaelmas, for the feast of Saint Michael the Archangel.
Okay.
Which in Anglo-Saxon England was celebrated a little bit earlier in the year than our Saint Michael feast of Saint Michael and the Archangels is in the Orthodox Church, because it was originally the celebration of the dedication of a famous church to Saint Michael in Italy.
Yeah, Michaelmas, which a big feast.
Yes, big feast.
See, I just had to make a little Old English joke.
Hilarious. All right, so
thank you.
But let us now bid the high angel Saint Michael and the 9 orders of holy angels, that they might be an aid for us against hell foes. By the way, that's one of the words that's used for Grendel in Beowulf. They were
also the name of my next band.
Yeah, hell foes. They were the holy ones for the taking of the souls of men. So Saint Paul was looking in the northern region. This is the Visio Poli that is being referenced now. So St. Paul was looking in the northern region of this world where all the waters dropped down, and he saw that there over that water a certain Hoar Stone, Hoar, Hoar Stone, And north of that stone, very frosty woods had grown. And there were dark mists, and under that stone was the dwelling place of Nicors and Wergs. And he saw that, yep, there it is. Both Nicors, which are kind of a sea serpent, which comes up over again in the Beowulf poem, and then Wergs, as in wargs.
Yeah,
from Middle Earth. Yeah. And he saw that on that cliff hung on the icy trees, many black souls bound by their hands, and their enemies in the likeness of Nicors were grasping at them just like the greedy wolf. And that water was black down under the cliff, and between the cliff and the water was about 12 miles. And when the branches broke, then those souls that had been hanging on those branches fell, and the Nicors seized them. These, then, were those souls who unjustly had sinned here in the world and did not wish to stop before their life's end. But let us now bid St. Michael eagerly that he lead our souls into joy, where they might rejoice always without end in eternity. Amen.
This is way better than Jonathan Edwards.
Yeah. I mean, yeah, if you want to put the fear of God into somebody, like, forget Calvinism, like, medievalists, the Middle Ages, they got you when it comes to this stuff. Like, they got you.
Big time.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, so this is this really amazing description of hell, which is almost identical. So there are 14 formulaic phrases here, which are identical to the descriptions that were given of the mere where Grendel and his mother live in the Beowulf poem.
Yeah.
And the homily is composed after the Beowulf poem, so the poet can't be quoting the homily. And so all of the evidence now suggests that both the Beowulf poet and the homilist had access to the same Latin recension, it's the Latin recension. It's a vernacular translation of the Latin recension of the apocryphal Visio Pauli, the Apocalypse of St. Paul.
Got it.
There you go. Many of the terms that are used for Beowulf as a slayer of monsters are also used for St. Michael. And so here's the point that I wanted to make. Well, one of the points is that in between Beowulf's first two battles with the monsters, the tech deliberately or surreptitiously compares him to two famous dragon slayers that our audience would have been familiar with. One is Sigemund, a pagan, but the other, which people have missed until recently, is St. Michael, who is the great sort of Christian dragon slayer, along with St. George, of course.
Yeah.
And this sort of brings us to Grendel's mother. And so I just want to very briefly say that if Grendel is related to the Gigantes of the Enochian tradition, Grendel's mother is depicted here as a siren, not a Greek siren, like from the Odyssey, but the older Semitic version, which is a violent, flesh-eating monster, a wanderer in the waste, the companions of demons and other monsters. And according to the Book of Enoch, so much of the debate in the literature around the Book of Enoch revolves around the identity of the sons of God, but little attention has been paid to the fate of the daughters of men, which according to 1 Enoch, chapter 19, verse 2, that the wives of the angels who went astray shall become sirens.
So that's women.
Yeah.
Human women.
Yes.
Become these demonic flesh-eating.
Yes.
Yeah.
And so even during the classical period, sirens had sort of changed from being depicted initially as like half bird, half human, but potentially male or female, to being associated mainly with bodies of water, exclusively feminine. This is how you find them in the Latin bestiaries with which the Beowulf poet might have been familiar. But in any case, all of this, it seems very clear that her description here as a mirwith, like how if you were going to translate siren into Old English, that's how you say it, mirwith, right? Or the mere woman, a kind of creature or monster, which, by the way, is completely absent from Germanic mythological sources.
Oh, that's interesting. I mean, this kind of
Grendel's mother is not a Germanic, is not a monster from Germanic paganism.
She's from out there somewhere.
Yeah,
it's funny. There is. We should definitely do some stuff about Baltic folklore, fairy tales. But there is a Baltic water demon called a Vandenis. It's basically this. It's essentially this kind of thing. And you know, Lithuanian parents and grandparents will even still tell their kids, like, look, if you don't behave, the Vandenis will crawl up out of the river and drag you down into it and drown you. You know, so like this kind of thing is you know, this is the source of nightmares. You know,
so there's a lot more. There's a lot more I could say, but I'm going to skip for time's sake because I want to get to the sword. But there's a lot more that I could say here. But suffice it to say that Grendel's mother comes from the Book of Enoch. There's nothing extant in Germanic mythology that would really account for her. That she really does, in fact, seem to come from the Book of Enoch. So that being said, why don't you talk about the giant slaying, in parentheses, sword, with which Grendel kills Grendel, with which Beowulf kills both Grendel and Grendel's mother.
Yeah, so as you mentioned, Beowulf rips Grendel's arm off. Grendel runs home to mom. And he goes down and finds Beowulf goes down and under the water and battles it out with the mother, and he finds this sword there, right? There's this sword, and it's described in the text as being the work of giants, right? So there's the phrase giganta gework. So you can hear giganta, you can hear giants, and gework is like it's something that's truly made by giants. But he also got enta arjework. So again, it's using now this Old English word for giant, enta or eoten. And it is also referred to as eotenish, sort of giantish sword. And so the sword that he finds down there is giantish in one way or another. I remember when I encountered this sword, there's a really curious thing. So, Beowulf brings the sword back when he's bringing all his trophies back to Hrothgar to let him know, like, everything's going to be okay now. I have vanquished my foes, your foes. Let the hall dreams begin again. Bring out the mead, bring out the beer. No more cracking of bones and such. He brings back, the head of Grendel, but also this sword, which actually, as I recall, when he cuts off the head, doesn't most of the sword melt away?
Yeah, that's right. The blade melts away, which is an incredibly vivid thing, by the way.
Yeah. But the hilt is left. The hilt is left, right? So the bit that you hold on to, that's left. So he brings back the hilt as a kind of trophy, and he shows it to Hrothgar. Now, Hrothgar looks at this thing, and it's a little ambiguous in the text as to whether there is a sort of picture on the hilt of the flood, like the flood from Genesis. Okay, but okay. So that's what sort of sets this up. So you might ask the question of, like, okay, if this thing is the work of giants, if it's made by giants, why would they depict the flood on the hilt of this sword? That's the question that comes to mind. And in trying to figure this out, we learn all kinds of fun giant and Enoch and so forth along the way, right? So what's interesting is when I started researching this, I discovered that most scholars don't really even, for whatever reason, they don't seem to be interested in this question. But to me, it's really fascinating. But there is...
By the way, kids, if you're at home and you just want to do scholarship, a great way to start is just to, find what's something that's interesting to you that everyone else seems to ignore.
Right.
And just, pursue that thread.
Exactly. A lot of the stuff that I write is about that when I'm doing academic work.
Same.
So now there is one argument which is that the sword is intended to predate the flood. So that this is an ancient weapon, and that the language that's on the sword's hilt is supposed to be Hebrew. Okay. So why would Hebrew be there before the flood? Well, the idea is that Hebrew is the one human language that survives the flood, and it's the...
Do you remember where that theory came from?
It's in a lot of universal history stuff, as I recall. The idea that Hebrew is like...
Oh, no, not language. That. I mean, the idea that there's Hebrew on the sword.
Oh, I don't remember now who it was that I was reading that had
the idea that Hebrew was the original Adamic tongue is in Jubilees and lots of other things.
Yeah, it's everywhere.
Yeah.
It's everywhere.
Anyway, sorry, didn't mean
it's all good. Yeah, so the idea that this is the language being spoken in the Tower of Babel before everything gets split up, right? So if the sword actually comes from before the flood, then this kind of solves the problem, because that means that what's on the flood is not what's on the hilt is not a depiction of the flood at all, because that if it's made before the flood, then they what wasn't on there. Most scholars seem to believe that actually there is a depiction of the flood on the hilt, that when Hrothgar picks it up, he sees the flood in some way, whether it's written out by words or there's pictures. It's not super clear. So I'm going to assume that it actually does depict the flood, because that to me is the more interesting take on this. So there are, why would this be the case? So some would point to traditions about giants surviving the flood, right? These traditions would have been known to the Beowulf poet. You can see this in a lot of medieval stuff. For instance, there's certain medieval legends. This is my favorite part, is that the giant Og, who is king of Bashan, was like Noah's, there's one version where he's Noah's servant. And he kind of stows away on the ark. Another one is he's just one of the giants that's around, and he grabs onto the bottom of the ark and just sort of hangs on for dear life for 40 days and 40 nights, and then for how long it takes the water to go away. This doesn't actually offer solution to the problem of why this sword would have this on there, right? But it does explain, like, okay, how can there be giants after the flood who are making swords? Because it's this idea that being a giant is something you sort of inherit, rather than being the result of specific demonic rituals and so forth, right? But anyway, this kind of all feeds into the stuff that the Beowulf poet is sort of playing with. So there's another possibility, which is that you can make a distinction between the antediluvian biblical gigantes, which the poem uses that word, right? Gigantes is what it is in Greek, and the Germanic Eotenus. So saying that the biblical giants and Germanic Eotens are not the same thing. So if Grendel and his mom are Eotenus and they're not gigantes, then that means if the sword is entagewerk, made by Eotens, then the problem is solved at least a little bit, because then you don't have to explain why a giant from before the flood would depict his own people's defeat, or a giant descended from the giants from before the flood. In other words, it's saying these Germanic giant figures are not the giant figures that are at the flood, so who cares? They'd be like, well, I'm depicting an event that happened that wasn't to my people. It's sort of the thing, right? But the problem is, of course, that the text uses Eotenish and Gigantegewerk interchangeably. It basically says identifies Gigantes and Eotenus. They're the same thing, and it uses both those terms when talking about the sword. So that doesn't solve it either, right? So, okay, so we're talking about Enochic literature and Beowulf, so this presents us with an actual possible solution. But you have to ask first, I've sort of been dancing around this, how can there be giants before and after the flood? All right? So there's this idea, of course, that, some giant survives the flood, hangs onto the ark, whatever, and then through him the giant race is repopulated. But this doesn't solve the problem of why those people would have a sword that depicts their ancestors' defeat. Like, why would you do that? Because you're essentially shaming your ancestors, and that's not a thing. So there is a scholar named Ruth Mellenkopf, and she has done several different papers on Enochic literature in Beowulf. If you can dig this stuff up, people, it's worth reading. She has this bit, which I thought was interesting, because it kind of summarizes a lot of these problems. She says, some of the later writings in First Enoch present a less consistent view of the giants, where giants and spirits are not as carefully distinguished. They are, moreover, sometimes contradictory, one passage suggesting that the giants became evil spirits, and another suggesting that the fallen angels became evil spirits, leading men astray to sacrifice to demons, while the women they married, and here you go, were transformed into sirens. Okay? So these are various giant traditions, from the ancient Near East that the Beowulf poet would have been familiar with. If you bring all of this stuff together, there actually is a solution to the problem of why this is depicted on the sword. So I'm going to walk through some of these traditions so that we understand this. I know it's a little complex, but you guys, I know, are here for it. So here we are.
Keep talking. So, I'm just going to unplug the heater.
Okay, good night. So the biblical origin of antediluvian giants found in Genesis chapter 6, verse 4. We know this. We mentioned this. Which says that the sons of God engage in these sexual relations with human women, resulting in the heroes of old, the Nephilim. So, as we mentioned, this phrase, sons of God, is used unambiguously in multiple places in the Old Testament to refer to angels, okay? And we already talked about the interpretation found in rabbinic and also post-Nicene patristic tradition that the sons of God are descendants of Seth, mating with the daughters of Cain. though it's not super clear without the introduction of some kind of demonic element, how the intermarrying of these two human groups would have resulted in giants. But if you apply the reading of sons of God, meaning angels, then there is some kind of union happening between fallen angels and human women, creating these semi-divine, whatever, giants. The Beowulf poet does not specify the origin of his Eotenus. He refers to Cain, but, that doesn't necessarily mean a literal descent. So this reading actually directly parallels what we see in classical mythology, in which you get these divine beings mating with humans. They result in demigods, Hercules, Achilles, Hippolyta. Here's a fun fact that maybe you don't know, kids. This association of biblical giants with classical pagan demigods gets made explicit when Alfred the Great does his translation into Old English of Boethius's Consolation of Philosophy. Did you know this, Richard? You must have known this. Mm-hmm. Did you know this? Okay, yep. You're just nodding. Okay, just checking. So in the section where Boethius briefly alludes to giants, Alfred adds a bunch of text. He's not translating now. Now he's adding.
I know. I've written on this. I think I've talked to you about this.
It could be. I think so. Probably. Yeah. And what Alfred says is that the biblical account is a correction of the pagan one about the Titans.
Yeah. I'll just add that this is. So I wrote something on this, and I've talked about this a few different times because it is one of a clear case of scholars not actually reading the things that they're writing about, because there is a thing that you'll even find this in the main scholarship on the in critical introductions to the Anglo-Saxon Boethius. And what they'll say is that, Alfred excises all the pagan references because he's offended by them as a Christian. And of course, what they want to believe is that Boethius actually not a Christian, even though he wrote, famous works on the Trinity and other things. He's actually like a crypto-pagan, so he's like sneaking pagan philosophy back in. But Alfred is just this dumb, or whoever is right, they don't believe Alfred did it either. But in any case, Alfred is just this sort of like dumb hick on the outskirts of the civilized world. And so when he's doing his translation, he wants to excise all the Christian, all the pagan elements. But actually Alfred doesn't do that. He actually adds new content. Whenever he adds Wayland in. Wayland obviously not in Boethius. Right. Like the Anglo-Saxon god of the forge, not in Boethius. Alfred adds him in. Alfred also adds in a ton of extra information about the giants, because what he's doing is he's actually saying, no, these things actually are accounted for in Christianity.
Yeah, he's doing universal history.
He's just adding more content about it. Yeah.
Yeah. I told you, by the way, that my great-grandmother's maiden name was Wayland, which means
yeah.
I'm basically a descendant of anyway.
Well, I mean, I'm descended from Odin, so...
as are most of us, actually, with any kind of white people blood.
Yeah.
So the question then is, and again, listen to the Lord of Spirits episode about giants, but I'm just going to summarize some of what's in there because I think it's important here. How is it that gods can mate with humans? Okay, gods are immaterial beings. Humans are material beings. There's not divine DNA that can splice. This is not a thing. It's not a thing. But raising that question is part of what gives rise to the whole Sethi hypothesis, because it's saying, look, these are humans mating with humans, and that's just all there is to it. But there's actually some interesting clues in the Bible that suggest that's not quite all there is to it. And one of the clues is that our old friend Og had a big, big bed, 15 feet long, in fact, roughly. This is mentioned in Deuteronomy chapter 3, verse 11. And it also describes, 13 feet roughly. It also describes Og as one of the Rephaim, who are a giant clan. Okay, so why would he have a big bed? Well, you could say, Og must be a big, big dude. Probably not, literally speaking, but there's a good chance that this bed is actually a ritual bed, especially because it was found there was a bed like this found at a place called Edamananki, which is a ritual center. It's not just somebody's bedroom. So there's ritual beds in a lot of temples in the ancient Near East. Okay. That means they're doing rituals with regards to beds. That means, well, this is a family show, but you guys know what I mean. that's what beds would be used for in ancient paganism. So there's this idea, like this kind of thing, for instance, it's mentioned in Sumerian texts, right? There's a text called Gilgamesh Enkidu in the Netherworld, which is a text that's actually older than the Epic of Gilgamesh. And this mentions how when Inanna is having her temple built, she makes sure that there's a bed in there, you know? And the idea is that there's these rituals going on between men and women, and then a deity becomes involved in this as well, in the ritual. And so what you get from that coupling is a sort of supercharged human, right? Which is a giant, not necessarily a very tall person. Giant.
Although in Beowulf, it definitely means.
And Beowulf, that's the depiction, absolutely. And in a lot of depictions, this is why the bed is so big, is because it's a ritual size.
Right.
It's a ritual size to accommodate the spirit of the god. So from the point of view of pagans, right, these rituals would have produced heroes and god kings empowered by gods with favor and glory, whatever. From the biblical point of view, the gods of the nations are demons. So this is a very demonic, evil, horrifying thing. And so it produces humans that are deeply, deeply involved with demons. This is basically the opposite of what a saint is.
Yeah.
Okay. Yeah. Like these are anti-saints, right? So in Beowulf, in the Beowulf poem, Grendel and his mother, they are frequently excoriated. Like the poet has it out for them. They're described as sinful, beyond redemption, and they function like the biblical giants. They're, even if not the same exact origin explicitly, like this is how they function, okay? We don't get an origin story for them except in some way they're from Cain. So what does it mean to be a monster and to have the human Cain as your ancestor? Well, it doesn't have to mean that you're a monster, that monsters are like non-human species. In fact, the Beowulf poet describes Grendel and his mother. Most of the words he uses to describe them are human words, much more human words than beastie or even demonic words. So like there's words like rinch, wer, and so rinch is basically like warrior, wer means man, Halthane, Halthane, like these are all human words. So it's strongly kind of suggesting that these are kind of demonized humans on some level, although
there's also a lot of irony there, which is like a really Anglo-Saxon, a predominant Anglo-Saxon poetic technique.
Sure.
Right. And so with Halthane specifically is the one I'm thinking of here. Like he's like obviously not a good Halthane. But yes, right. But yeah, like just right. Like manifestly the worst Halthane ever. Right. We're only calling him that to be, the sort of Anglo-Saxon tendency is to be sarcastic and to kind of understate things a little bit. Yeah. But your point stands. The Halthane in particular.
It's still a very English tendency, I think.
Yeah. I think so.
It's still the same. I mean, there's still Anglo-Saxons in their hearts.
I mean, I'm never sarcastic, so.
Okay, so let's set aside the idea that giants survived the flood in a bodily sense, which, by the way, is not in the Bible. Like the Bible never says that. The idea is that they're all wiped out. That's kind of the whole point.
Well. There are, the giants do show up later. The question is why, but yes.
Why? Right. Yeah. And we've kind of answered that, which is giants are produced by ritual pagan behavior involving these beds. Right. So that means if they're doing that before the flood, they can certainly do it again after the flood.
And I will say that is definitely part of the subtext of the Beowulf poem. There's a whole school of thought of studying the Beowulf poem that sees it as the conflict between the sort of old bog pagan worship and the sort of the basically when the bog stopped being the focus of ritual life, and that was sort of moved to the hall, and then obviously with Christianization moved to the city. Yeah. Right. Yeah. Very much. Yeah. That seems to be very much the case that we're definitely to understand that Grendel and his mother are definitely engaging in demonic practices, pagan practices, and in fact, the whole sort of upshot, one of the connections between Grendel's mother and the women of, the daughters of men in the book of Enoch, is the fact that it is because of the depredations of Grendel and his mother that the Danes are being led back towards paganism. So it says like they get really desperate and they start to sacrifice to the old gods again.
That's right.
Yeah.
That's in the text.
Yeah.
But there is a way actually that we can connect the giants from before the flood with these, besides just the ritual activity. So like one of the ideas that's you can find in Second Temple Jewish literature, but also also ancient Near Eastern pagan literature, like Sumerian stuff, is this idea that the spirits of these giants, after they're wiped out by the flood, that the spirits persist even though their bodies are gone.
Yeah.
Okay. And so, these spirits are depicted, like in Jubilees, they're depicted, which is a Second Temple Jewish text, they're depicted as attacking Noah and his sons, tormenting them, tempting them, all this kind of stuff. And this is why Noah prays to God, can you please do something about this? And then 90% of them are sent into the abyss. In some of the pagan texts, a number of the god kings of the Sumerians, they will claim that they are in touch with a spirit from before the flood, like one of these dead giants, basically, a spirit of a dead giant. And that these spirits, which are called apkallu, also the seven sages, like there's 7 of them in these Mesopotamian traditions, they are giving them secret wisdom. Okay? They're whispering in the ears of these god kings and saying, this is how you defeat your enemies. Here's some technology. Here's some sorcery. Here's cosmetics. That's one of the things that's listed. Certain kinds of seductive music. But even stuff like, here's how you become wealthy and powerful. Like, okay, here's some agricultural techniques that you might not have heard of. And so the idea is that this spirit from before the flood is whispering this wisdom in their ear. What's fun is, like, there's a text called the Sumerian Kings List, which was preserved on these cuneiform clay tablets and cylinders that were found in Mesopotamia. This is the kind of stuff you can go see at I think it's called the Institute for the Study of Ancient Cultures now in Chicago, but it used to be called the Museum of the
Oriental.
Yeah, Oriental Institute. That was it, the Oriental Institute. Yeah, they don't want to use the word Oriental anymore. So you can see these things, and the Book of Giants, which is a lesser known text in the Sumerian, in the Dead Sea Scrolls, lists these giants, and Gilgamesh is listed as one of the giants himself, but also that he has this apkallu that's speaking to him, and so the idea is then that these god kings, because they have this connection with this giantess descent through the ritual activity, but also because they have a dead giant talking in their ear, they have this wisdom. So this ancient antediluvian wisdom from before the flood, it's like digging up Atlantis. Yeah. Because actually it turns out that Atlantis is another version of the same story about giants being wiped out in a flood. Go read the texts in Plato about Atlantis, which no one seems to do. It's a story about giants being killed by a flood. They're all children of Poseidon, in that story. We should absolutely do a story.
We'll definitely do
episode
Atlantis.
just about flood myths.
Atlantis and Atlantis myths would be a ton of fun.
Big time.
Yeah.
Okay, so I know I said all that to tell you this. This actually solves the problem of why you would have this sword with the flood depicted on it. And this is my theory. It happens to fit all the facts, I think. This sword that's made by giants, that's what's said in the text, that depicts the flood, or at least alludes to it in some way. It's found by Beowulf in this underwater cave. It does not have to be read as a contradiction with a giant swordsmith kind of weirdly hammering the most humiliating defeat of his own kind into the hilt. We can read it as the swordsmith is functioning within the apkallu tradition, or the watcher tradition, that would have been known in the Anglo-Saxon Christian world, right? Because this is in lots of these kinds of texts.
Yeah.
So by depicting the flood on the hilt, this might be that a claim is being made to antediluvian wisdom, right? This ancient secret skill that bolsters both the authority of the swordsmith and the bearer of the sword. So Beowulf's use then of the Eotenish sword to destroy the giants that are near Heorot is turning their own might, their own wisdom, their own power against them. So he's acting as the agent of God, continuing justice against the wickedness of demonized humans or humanoids that's been ongoing since the flood. So it's my how the turntables have,
how the
as is said. Exactly. Yes. So that's my bit about the Eotenish sword. I think it works. I think it works.
I think it works. I think that it once you just understand that there's every reason to believe the Beowulf poet had access to Christian apocryphal writings, which were very current and very well attested actually in Anglo-Saxon England before the Norman conquest. Everything else just just falls into place, fits very easily. Yeah. And this understanding that we're talking about for the first you could say 800-900 years of Christianity is basically universal. Everybody knows these stories. Everybody saw that it was very obvious how you would fit your pagan culture into Christianity once you Christianized. Like it was very obvious. You could say, oh, wait a minute, we have been worshiping gods, but those gods were, and then making all the different connections. So yeah,
there's so much in Christianity, and especially the Bible itself.
Yeah,
that is. It's not about saying, okay, all these pagan stories are just not true.
Yeah.
No. It's like, okay, actually, you've got the facts mostly right, but you're understanding them wrong. This is what's really going on.
And what's great about the Beowulf poem is that it gives us a hero who is a hero by all of the sort of Indo-European hero measures, but he's taking the side of God in the feud.
Yeah.
Like everybody in the ancient world knows there's a feud between God and the monsters. And Beowulf is taking the side of God. So you're going to like this last one, I think.
Okay.
A common complaint about the poem is the way that the dragon seems to not have anything to do with the first two monsters. And so modern retellings of the poem very often try to connect them, always disastrously. I would suggest that a connection exists, which would have been evident to the poet's Anglo-Saxon Christian audience, but which is lost to modern audiences, as well as to many very siloed modern academics. Although, obviously, we've mentioned scholars in the course of this, right, who did the work that we're talking about. So they are out there. But for the most part, if you're going to go to a conference or get a grant, it's going to be, typically speaking, it's going to be about gender stuff in Beowulf or something like that.
I'll say, by the way, like a lot of the good scholarship done on Enoch in Beowulf is from the 1970s.
Yeah. That's right.
Which actually is when there was a big burst of scholarship about Enochic literature, ancient Near Eastern literature, Second Temple Judaism that was going on in the 60s and 70s. And God bless some of these people. They're like, wait a minute. We could apply that to this,
You may be frightened to learn that was over 50 years ago now, Father. I know.
You can make me have a heart attack.
Oh, yeah. All right, so Anglo-Saxon poetry and Germanic poetry in general uses a poetic device called the formula. And the formula is it's a stock phrase, but it's instead of like a line, it's usually like two words.
Okay.
But when the formula appears, it will appear in relation to other things. And then basically the way it works is as kind of like a hyperlink. So it's like dropping a reference in a poem, except it's like a little two-word phrase, like he wax under Welknum, like three words. Yeah. He grew under the sky is what that means, right? He waxed under Welkin. Welkin, bring it back, people. Great name for the sky. Old Norse sky is definitely a Norse word, but Welkin, that's the Old English word for the sky. So bring it back.
Helvenum. I'm a big Helvenum.
Helvenum is all right, but Helvenum means something different, though. It means Helvenum means all the stuff, right? Welkin is where the clouds are.
Exactly.
Yeah. So anyway, that is a stock phrase that appears in Beowulf and in some old Norse sagas and things like that. So when we come across these formulae, basically you have to look for what's clustered around it, and then go and compare that to where you find the formula somewhere else. And it basically creates a bridge, like an intertextual bridge between different story texts. So that's when we talk about formulae. So when we say something like the Blickling homily has 14 different formulae in its description of hell, that you also find in the Beowulf poem, right? Well, and so we can go look for all these little phrases, and we see, hey, listen, these phrases always show up in these relationships. They always show up in this order, right? And so we can say that's a formulaic usage. Okay, so if we look at the formulaic evidence here, the connection between the first two monsters and the dragon is actually very clear. So I'm going to read a little bit from the just before the dragon fight begins. Enraged, the ruler of the waiter Geat, that's Beowulf, let a word burst forth from his breast, shouted starkly. The sound echoed, resounding battle clear, under the grey stone. That is, under Hoar Stone. And later, after the fight with the dragon ends, I'm going to go and just read this one too, for time's sake. Later, after the fight with the dragon ends, Beowulf gazes upon the dragon's lair. And then eventually he sends faithful Wiglaf inside. And it says, when the wound which the earth dragon had worked on him began to burn and swell, he soon realized that in his breast was an evil force, a poison welling. Then the nobleman went, still wise in thought, so that he sat on a seat by the wall. On that work of giants he gazed, Seach on Enta Iwerk, saw how stone arches and sturdy pillars held up the inside of that ancient earth hall. Now go quickly, he says to Wiglaf, to look at the hoard under the hoary stone, under Hoar Stone. Dear Wiglaf, so that the worm lies dead. Then the hoard in that barrow, as I've heard, was looted. Ancient work of giants, Eld Entna Iwerk, by one man alone. Yeah. So everywhere else in the poem, and in much of the formulaic evidence of the rest of the extant Anglo-Saxon corpus, the pairing of Hoar Stone with Entna Iwerk is used to refer to the antediluvian civilization, to the giants who warred with God and who were, for the most part, destroyed by the Great Flood. And that's, I mean, very clear in everything that you just argued. It's very clear throughout the first 2/3 of the Beowulf poem. It's there in Andreas. It's there in all this other Anglo-Saxon literature. Grendel and his mother are part of this cursed lineage. And so the first two monster fights of the poem are about Beowulf, who is a kind of virtuous pagan, settling the feud between God/humanity, God and the humans who side with him, and the monsters. There's absolutely no reason to believe that the fight with the dragon is anything different. The dragon is, of course, the final enemy. And in fact, a dragon appears in the book of Enoch. Dragon appears in the Blickling homily. The dragon appears in the Visio Poli. The dragon is the final enemy. Death.
Dragon appears in the Bible.
Yes, dragon appears in the Bible. Dragon appears in Beowulf.
Yeah.
The dragon is, of course, the final enemy. Death, he's the devil. But also, it seems to be that he may also be the last survivor.
Oh,
so
that's interesting.
In the Beowulf poem, there is this little section, one of the digressions, usually called the Lay of the Last Survivor. And it's when we're getting the backstory on the horde, the dragon's horde.
Yeah.
And it's this man that's standing there, and he's about to seal the horde up forever. And then he's thinking about the fact that his clan has been completely destroyed. It's been completely wiped out. There's nothing left. And then he seals the barrow. And it kind of implies in the text, maybe he seals himself in. And there is definitely, this is a very Germanic idea, the idea that nobody starts out as a dragon. You become a dragon by sitting on a horde. This is how Fafnir became a dragon. There's a famous dragon in the Jomsviking saga who becomes a dragon in this way. And so my old dear Professor Tom Shippey believes, and I agree with him, that the last survivor may actually be the dragon here.
Oh, man.
Now, if this is the case, think about the fact that he's the remnant of a people who had been completely destroyed by some feud. The question is, who were the people that were destroyed in the feud? Well, they have this huge underground civilization, the work of giants.
Yeah.
The work of giants. He's transformed into a dragon to guard his people's treasure. However you want to slice it, I think the language of the poem clearly encourages us to see the dragon in these terms. And there's a final hint here, because all of the fight sequences in the Beowulf poem have a chiastic structure to them. And the center of the chiasm always tells you which perspective is the most important in the poem. So the dragon fight, you have...
I was going to say, if you don't know what a chiasm is, or a chiasmus, it's basically when something goes one direction and then returns. So like
that's right.
A B B A.
Yeah.
You know that, and so it creates this X shape. Right. Which is why it's called a chiasm. Chi, the letter which looks like a letter X in Greek. Right. That's why it's called that.
Yeah. Someday we might actually do a ancient poetic or ancient literary technique episode.
Sure,
where we just like go through them and see how they're used, because these are like universal storytelling patterns, and if you know to look for them, then it teaches you how to read ancient stuff. All right, so in the dragon fight, the emphasis, in Beowulf's own words, the emphasis is on the fact that, so there's a speech at the beginning, there's a speech in the middle, there's a speech at the end of the dragon fight, right? So the emphasis is on the way that Beowulf has been not a good king, which is what you'd expect. Hrothgar, good king. Hermod, bad king. Shield shaving, good king. Beowulf never called the good king by the poem. Never, not a single time. Even though like he's manifestly a good king.
Good king, yeah.
You know, he rules for 50 years, basically in peace. For 50 years, they had to have peace because literally nobody wants that smoke. Like, nobody wants to fight Beowulf for any reason. And so they're all like, you know what? The feuds that we had going, forget about it, right? But that is not how Beowulf thinks of himself. Beowulf thinks of himself as a good vassal, somebody who has settled feuds and defended his lord. And then he says, and thus the king of heaven, who is, of course, the true king, will have no reason to complain about me on the day of judgment. And this long speech, which begins before the dragon fight, ends after it, frames this cosmic feud in the terms of the lesser human feuds that Beowulf has fought. But it is in settling the cosmic feud that Beowulf meets his end.
Yeah, so it's really literally about spiritual warfare, you know? Or one could also say that people get excited when you talk about giants for at least 1,300 years.
For at least 1,300 years. Well, I mean, and the thing is, like, if you think about the fact that the poem is about spiritual warfare, very, very artistically, very, very artistically laid out. Like the Beowulf poet was a generational talent for sure. But if you think about this, if you think about the fact that, you know, suddenly the fact that it would have been written in a monastery becomes less perplexing.
Yeah. I think so much can be gotten out of this poem, frankly, just by looking at it really closely and not just sort of writing it off, which it seems that a lot of scholars for a long time just kind of wrote it off.
Well, it's gone through different phases. That early on, they were just looking for historical references, and they were like, what are all these stupid monsters about? Right. And then Tolkien kind of turned the tide on that, but maybe almost too successfully the other direction. And then obviously there's a famous retelling of a story from Grendel's perspective called Grendel that came out. And basically ever since then, people have just been interested in, well, what does the story have to say about marginalized people? Or what does the story have to say about gender and power dynamics? Or what is the story? Well, the story is actually not about those things.
No.
It is about the feud of God with the monsters.
Yeah.
And which side our heroes are on.
Yeah.
That's what the poem is about.
All right, so why don't we go ahead and check in with our chat?
Oh, yeah, chat's been real active today.
It's been pretty active. I've scrolled all the way back to the beginning, right when we first started. And one of our comments we got was from Luke Shepard. And Luke was very, very enthusiastic at the beginning. He says, this is going to be epic. I can never get enough of all things giants and Enochic lore, plus it'd be great to learn more about the story. Well,
this is your episode today, buddy.
Yeah, I hope we came through for you, Luke.
And if you haven't read the story, I really hope that you'll go and want to read it now.
Yeah, and we recommend the Liutza translation. Mm-hmm. It's beautiful for one thing, and it really pays a lot of attention to the sound in the original Old English. But also, someone else asked about the Tolkien translation, which we haven't mentioned. It's a prose translation. It's very good, but it is mostly
barely prose.
It's mostly
like it's prose, but it almost completely scans as Anglo-Saxon poetry.
A proem.
Don't do that. Don't do that.
Sorry. You don't like portmanteaus?
Yeah, the Tolkien's translation is not a translation. It is a crib that he put together for his students.
Notes. Yeah, it's notes for his students.
Yeah.
So, right. Sam Cook asks, if the meat at Heorot spoiled, would something be rotten in the state of Denmark? Well, Denmark is not really a state at this point.
Yeah, except for the state part, sure. Yeah, definitely. Yeah. I mean, there's definitely a rotten in Denmark. Something's rotten in Denmark joke in my notes. That's for sure.
Yes, there is, in fact.
Okay, actually, I'll just throw this out here as a teaser. I'm not going to explain it, but the original story on which Hamlet is based is actually mentioned in Beowulf. That's how old that story is.
There we go. There we go.
There you go.
I mean, since we mentioned it, though, we'll do a little philological commentary. So Denmark means, the marches or the area of the Danes.
Yeah, the Danes.
You know, so it's I actually went to seminary with a guy who was from Denmark, and he often referred to it as the Mark, which that made my heart sing every single time he did that. Yeah. He's from the Mark. I was like, I'm going to seminary with a man of the Mark.
Let's see. Haig says, so the Saga of Volsungs comes after Beowulf. Very interesting. Yes. The story of the Volsungs is older than the story of Beowulf, probably. Yeah. But this is the first time that it is mentioned in a surviving text. Let's put it that way. So when we say first extant, that's what we mean. We mean this is the first surviving text. And only about 5% of what was written down in ancient times has survived to the present day.
That is such a sad truth.
I know. Especially in Northern Europe, which has weather that is hard on manuscripts and also lots of wars.
And a lot of centuries without literacy at all.
And honestly, like most of the stuff that was lost in Northern Europe, though, was lost during the Protestant Reformation. And the Beowulf manuscript was one of many manuscripts, which is basically saved by Jacobean antiquarians who are going around picking up all these these manuscripts that were just like in somebody's barn or somebody's kitchen cupboard after the monasteries had been looted under Henry VIII. So
I know, and then eventually gets put into a place named Ashburnham House.
Yes, if you want to make sure that a manuscript catches on fire, that's a good place to put it.
Which literally happened. If you look at which, by the way, the entire Beowulf manuscript can be read on the internet.
Yep.
And not just a transcription either.
Like an actual facsimile.
Pictures of the pages, and you can flip the pages and you can see that some of them are burned at the edges.
The fun thing is that almost all the fire damage is right at the pages where the dragon first comes in. So sometimes symbolism happens.
So great.
Yeah. Let's see here. Other good questions. Night Coffee says, the apocryphal books, so secret that they wound up spread across multiple continents in multiple languages.
Indeed. Yep. Yeah, we should just point out that the word apocrypha, it does mean secret, but it really means private, meaning these are texts that you read in private. For private reading, as distinct from publicly read in church as scripture. It's not like it's some secret esoteric. Right. We're not talking about Apkallu lore here.
Yeah.
This is not what this is. We got from, I'm not sure exactly how to pronounce this correctly, but from Carrie Kovac, I'm guessing Kovac, gave a donation along with saying,
to your arm.
God bless you and yours. So thank you very, very much.
Thank you very much.
Just a reminder, all donations go to Ancient Faith Ministries. They do not go in Richard's pocket for his shirt fund.
My shirt fund.
But if you do give a lot of money, if you do give donations, Richard will buy a shirt every so often.
That's right.
So that he's not just wearing plaid, because as we've discovered, that offends Matryoshka Trudy.
It does offend Matryoshka Trudy. I do have a t-shirt planned for next episode, which will be I actually have a couple of different good ideas for next episode, so I'm just trying to figure out what I can get away with. Actually, is going to be the main question.
And we should mention this, like we just did an episode last week, so for those of you watching in real time, the reason why we're doing one this week is because next week I'm not even sure exactly where I'm going to be, but I will be traveling.
And I will be at a clergy conference, so we're both.
Oh, well, there you go. We'll both be traveling. We'll both be otherwise engaged. So we want to still give you 2 episodes a month. So that's why we're here now as well. So
trying to see if there's any more really good questions here to address. Joseph Fenningston says he loves the Seamus Haney translation. It's just beautiful. Yeah, he just takes a lot of liberties. That's why I don't recommend it. It's sort of so it was published the same year as the Liuza translation, but of course Liuza was a fairly obscure except outside of philology circles, whereas Seamus Haney was already a famous poet, and so everybody bought Seamus Haney's translation. But in recent years, more and more people have discovered the Liuza translation, which again, like I said, is quite good. Haney's translation is, I consider it to be an artistic rendering based on Beowulf, and that is what it is. Like he takes his nickname. I mean, philologists are like the mean girls at the back of the class, and we have derogatory nicknames for every translator of Beowulf. For instance, Dithering Chickering, and of course, Shameless Seamus. So, wow. So I don't use the Haney translation to teach. If you enjoy reading it, that's a great. More power to you. It's just not my preferred translation of the poem.
Yeah. Okay, why don't we go ahead and wrap this up? So I know you've got some final thoughts on this one, Richard.
Yeah, so listen, there's a lot more to the Beowulf poem. It is really a masterful weaving together of these Christian themes together with what the poet thought he could bring in from his pre-Christian past. I do have a course on this if you want to know more about it. I just want to say that, as a kind of a concluding thought, is that Beowulf is the thing that, more than anything else, I would say even more than Tolkien, reading Beowulf is the thing that brought me into this whole world of old stories, of ancient legends, of ancient myths, and of ultimately of the Orthodox Church.
I mean, I think Tolkien would be very happy with that.
I think he'd be just fine with it. I think he'd be just fine with it. And there are lots of people who have taken the Beowulf story and they have tried to make it into all of these other things than what it is. But, and initially when I first started getting interested in Beowulf, that's, I was reading it through these other people's approaches. But the thing to do is to read the poem itself. And you can read it in Old English. Old English is not hard. But if you can't read it in Old English, read it in translation and chase the thing itself, chase the story itself. And if you do, there are whole worlds that you will discover, like especially the hard bits, the bits you get stuck on, the parts where you say, why is this even here, and what does this have to do with the rest of the story? You should actually, it's not a stupid question. That is the question you should always be asking when you're reading something ancient. And if you can really try to seriously and honestly answer that question, then it will open up worlds to you. And ultimately, the world that it opened up to me is a world in which it's the world of medieval Christianity. It was a world in which it was not just plausible, but really necessary for me to become an Orthodox Christian, because at this point, where else am I going to go? So it's my pitch. You should read Beowulf. You should read it early. You should read it often. And if you get stuck on the hard parts, give me a shout. Check out my courses. At me on Twitter, whatever. And let's talk about it. It is truly my favorite thing to talk about. The fact that we're doing this in a single episode is a greater act of restraint. A single episode, he says, we're almost 2 hours in. It's a greater act of restraint than I think any of you fully realize or appreciate.
It's true.
So thanks for tuning in today for our discussion about the Beowulf poem. If you were edified by this conversation, you guys know the drill. Like, subscribe, share, review. Our home is on YouTube, but we're also on Spotify and Apple Podcasts and all the other places that fine podcasts are sold.
Yeah, and if you're watching on YouTube, make sure you click the little bell when you subscribe so you get notified every time we put out a new episode, and that's twice a month. In our next episode, our plan is to bring the great Eoten of the swamp himself. That's right, the very Reverend Dr. Stephen DeYoung, 6 master's degrees, almost 2 PhDs, to talk with us about some myths from the ancient lost city of Ugarit.
I'm not sure, but I think this will be maybe the first time he and I have ever done a podcast together.
Oh, wow.
I'm trying to think if it's ever happened before. But I don't think it has. I think it's the first time we've ever been on a podcast together. So listen, I'm going to bring my A game. I have some ideas, t-shirt wise.
He's going to take you out, Richard Rohan.
Yeah, that's right. That's right. Well, you know what they say. The bigger they come, the harder they fall. All right. Well, remember, farewell. May you always trace the silhouette of virtue in everything that you read.
And this has been a listener and viewer supported presentation of Ancient Faith Radio.